Hello, and welcome to Ipsa Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'm your host, Brian L. Fry, Spears Gilbert Associate Professor of Law at the University of Kentucky College of Law. My guest is Doriane Coleman, Professor of Law at Duke Law School. We will discuss her article, Sex in Sport, which was published in Law and Contemporary Problems. So welcome to the podcast, Doriane.
Nice to be here, Brian.
Yeah. So I have to tell you that I am not particularly a sports person and hadn't spent much time thinking about sports at all before reading your article, and honestly didn't really know much of anything about the controversies that you're talking about. So it was really interesting for me as a first-time reader and kind of first-time sort of engager with a lot of these ideas to kind of get your, I think, really interesting and unique and kind of special perspective on this, kind of firsthand perspective on this issue. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the difference between sex and gender and why that difference presents a problem specifically in the context of competitive sports.
That's an excellent question, and really the central question that I address in my article. So sex, in the way that I use it, and it's important for everyone to sort of get on the same page with the vocabulary, because people use words differently, of course. The way I use sex in the piece is to mean what we normally think of as biological sex, including in all of its components. So genetic sex or chromosomal sex, and then gonadal sex, endocrine sex, phenotypic sex, and social sex. All of those aspects of sex come together to form the social sex piece aside. The other components come together to form what we typically consider biological sex. And then gender, although it's been used, really differently over the years in the legal academy and law, but also in other disciplines. In this context, really is used to mean gender identity and someone's internal sense of gender. And the debate in sport is really about the women's category in elite sport. And it can be about girls and women's sport more generally, but in the article I focus on the women's category in elite sport. And the reason that the focus of the discussion, the debate, the controversy is because the women's division in elite sport was essentially created or carved out or set aside, depending on the language you prefer, to provide an opportunity for biological females, again, used in the sex sense, for biological females to have an equal chance at the goods that flow from sport, from the institution that is sport, and then for sport to be able to use the women's category as a way to empower girls and women worldwide. The Olympic movement, sometimes it's viewed cynically, and sometimes that cynicism is warranted. But in general, sport has done, a really nice job over the decades, broadening the reach of the institution and the institutional goods to previously unrepresented and then underrepresented groups, and that includes females around the world. And so we carve out this space for females so that they can have an equal opportunity at the goods that flow from sport. And the reason it's necessary is because on average, females are not competitive with males in almost every sport. And so if we were to leave sport open or co-ed, we would at the elite level only see males, biological males by sex, male bodies, however you want to phrase it. Again, all those terms are freighted, but essentially you would only see males on the podium and in finals. And so to the extent that we think that it is valuable as a societal proposition to be able to use sport as an empowerment tool for girls, or to provide equal opportunity for girls and women in elite sport, then it's important to be able to provide or set the eligibility standard for women's elite sport, girls and women's elite sport, based in the sex-linked biology that matters for purposes of sport, and that that is the basis for the performance gap between males and females. And so the movement to empower, the sort of parallel related movement to empower intersex and trans people, including through sport also, collides with the goals of women's elite sport or elite sport for females in that it proposes to it essentially proposes or demands a new eligibility rule that takes out the biological sex basis for the category. So it would have eligibility for the women's category being defined, depending on who you talk to, either on the basis of gender identity alone or on the basis of gender identity plus some accommodation. For example, as the Olympic movement has done in the last 10 years or so, the requirement that trans women and athletes with differences of sex development reduce their testosterone levels to within the women's range in order to compete in the women's category. And so there's that collision between essentially the two approaches to defining eligibility for the women's category.
Mm-hmm. So in your paper, you break down a lot of these distinctions in a pretty granular way, and it seems to me like one big one is the difference between people with respect to gender identity as opposed to the questions posed by people who have some sort of like intersex quality where it's difficult to place them on the sort of sex continuum on one side or the other. And I was wondering if you talked about testosterone just a minute ago, which played an important role in your discussion of sort of why this distinction matters in thinking about categorizing people for the purpose of competitive sport. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the role of testosterone and also like how we should think about gender identity as opposed to sort of people who don't fit nicely, neatly on the kind of typical sex continuum.
Yeah. Another excellent question. The paper really focuses on intersex, on the challenge that intersex athletes pose for the eligibility rules and the women's category, and sort of the conception of what the women's category is about in elite sport. But of course, in the most immediate moment, a lot of the issues relate to trans athletes as well. I wanted to correct or just elaborate a bit on your premise, and that was the premise of your question. Your starting point, where you said that in contrast to transgender women, for example, intersex athletes might not be so easily pegged, and the reason I want to focus there for a minute to begin with is that the Olympic movement, and that includes the IOC, but the focus in this period, the International Olympic Committee, but the focus in this period is on the International Association of Athletics Federations, the IAAF, and its eligibility rule for intersex women or athletes with differences of sex development, which is the medical term for the political term that is intersex. So there are many, many different intersex conditions, over 30, depends on who you talk to, how many are actually listed in their references. But there are only a few that are of relevance to sport, and only a few as a result that are affected by the regulation. And so the regulation specifically lists individual intersex conditions that are regulated by the rule. And those intersex conditions all involve biological males. In other words, only athletes with 46XY differences of sex development. In other words, biological males with differences of sex development who have testes, testosterone levels in the male range, and are androgen sensitive. In other words, that testosterone is bioavailable at male levels. only those athletes are of concern to sport and are regulated by sport. So athletes,
Doriane,
yes.
could you talk a little bit more about the kind of the medical terminology used there? Because I think that that's a little confusing, and I don't necessarily think people will understand why testosterone is so important and what it means for it to be bioavailable.
Okay, that's great. So I said intersex is a political term, sort of an umbrella term for a set of conditions that are, and I use the word conditions in the medical sense. A lot of my work is in law and medicine, and so I tend, just for your own information and your listeners' information, I tend to speak sort of more medically than maybe most people, using medical terminology or assuming we're in a medical context than a lot of people do. And so intersex is a political term that is an umbrella term for a set of conditions that are mostly actually medical conditions that are called differences of sex development, or DSDs. And there are many of them, and some of them involve differences of sex development that males have, and some of them involve differences of sex development that females have. And then one is in between, which is a single intersex condition called ovotesticular disorder, which really is the two, right, in between ovotesticular. But most of them involve either males or females with some difference of development of sex organs. And the reason that DSDs, or intersex conditions, these particular intersex conditions, are relevant to women's sport is because they involve males with male testosterone levels who were identified at birth for lots of different reasons as females. In other words, it is decided that the word female rather than the word male will be placed on the child's birth certificate, and the child will be raised in that sex socially as they grow up, and they may or may not identify as female as they go through life. Gender identity is a different thing than social sex of rearing, for example, right? And so the reason that the focus is on testosterone, and I guess this gets back to your second main point, the reason the focus is on testosterone is because testosterone builds the secondary sex characteristics that matter for sport and that account for the performance gap between males and females. And so when I said earlier that if we made sport open or we made sport co-ed, we would no longer see female bodies on the podium, it's because male bodies have attributes that are developed during puberty and sustained past puberty by the different levels of testosterone in the male body. There are, of course, many different attributes people have that contribute to an individual performance, either on a given day or a given individual's performance over time. But the performance gap between males and females that accounts for or that supports or underlies or is the rationale for, I should say, the women's category or the carve out in elite sport for women are these sex-linked traits.
And how do we know? I mean, and is it always a problem? Only sometimes. I mean, it seems that in the article you point to some conditions that might place people who identify as women in the male category, but it seems like for other reasons they wouldn't be likely to be competitive in elite sports. But for some kinds of conditions, it would be an immense advantage to someone with that condition with respect to other people who identify as women or identify as females. What's the difference there, and where does it come from, and what makes somebody especially competitive who identifies as a woman but is biologically male?
So the conditions, and I'm going to go back to the point that I made earlier, the conditions that are of concern to sport are only those, and they're listed in the rule, right? And they have names, and I discussed the two main conditions in my article. But these conditions involve, because the athletes have testosterone levels in the male range, and that testosterone is bioavailable. They're not androgen insensitive, in other words. their bodies develop for all intents and purposes the same way a male body develops. And so they have the same advantages that males have who do not have differences of sex development. The differences of sex development in their case, because of their particular conditions, are affect aspects of their development that are unrelated to sports performance. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. No, I understand. Okay. And it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like the fundamental problem you're addressing in your paper is the sense that it would be unfair to expect people who are biologically women to compete in the same events with people who are biologically male. I mean, could you talk a little bit about sort of why that would be fundamentally unfair? Because you give some pretty interesting statistics in the paper that I thought kind of underscored the point well.
So it's important always to go back to first principles or home base, right? Why do we have a women's category in elite sport? We have a women's category in elite sport to provide a space where females can perform and can participate, compete, win. That excludes intentionally, right? That excludes biological males in the gonadal and endocrine sense that matters for the secondary sex characteristics that account for the performance gap. That's why we have female sport. And so to have an eligibility standard that is consistent with the reason for the existence of the category makes intuitive and logical and practical sense, right? And so to include someone or to make an exception for someone who has those same traits that the category was designed to exclude makes no internal sense, but it also is the premise for the argument that it's unfair to include those people, right? And so if the idea is that we could choose, for example, and this is an argument people make, and it's not entirely, it is entirely legitimate. We could choose to not to have women's sport, instead to have, for example, age classifications or weight classifications or height classifications, or we could cut the pie differently. And that's a policy debate that people want to have, and it's fine to have it. But to the extent that it makes sense to have a women's category, it is literally only because we need it because of these performance advantages that are derived from testosterone. And so the argument that it's unfair is an argument that goes to whether the category is protected for its intended purposes, or whether the inclusion of someone who has these traits that this category was designed to exclude is category defeating, right? So the argument that was made, for example, in the Semenya case by the IAAF is that to modify the eligibility standard to include athletes with T levels in the male range, T being testosterone, T levels in the male range, given the purposes of the category, is itself category defeating, right? It would be to redefine the category in a fundamental way, which is a policy move we could make, but we haven't made, right? And so the ground rules are set based on the goals for the category, which are to provide this space for females to compete against each other and not against males. And so we either decide we want to protect that category, or that policy choice, and thus the category using sex-linked traits, or we don't. I mean,
so
I'm sorry.
Sorry, I was going to say, I mean, it's my understanding that this question is on people's mind precisely because of this Carter-Semenya case that you mentioned. So, yeah, sorry?
Her name is Castor Semenya.
Castor, sorry. Castor Semenya. Yeah. So could you talk a little bit about sort of what was at stake in that case? Why it illustrates the problem the question that you're talking about so directly, and whether this is is this a common thing, or is it kind of the like an exception that isn't going to come up very often?
So the differences of sex development that are of most concern to sport, there are mainly two of them, but there's a list of about 8 in the rule. They are rare in the general population. They exist in all the conditions, including the 2 conditions of most concern to sport, are found in all populations around the world. And they are very rare. Intersex conditions in general, all 30 of them are very rare. But these 2 particular conditions, and then the group of 8 or so, the larger group of 8 or so, are even more rare than the most common of the intersex conditions, the differences of sex development. However, because the athletes who have the conditions of concern to sport are so powerful because of their testosterone, where they are identified at birth as female rather than as male, and in many countries they would be identified as male, but where they are identified as female, they have this just extraordinarily powerful advantage, which is their testes and their T levels in the male range. And so they're overrepresented, dramatically overrepresented in the elite female athlete population, if that makes sense.
Right. So this isn't like a unique outlier, kind of extremely unusual situation. This is actually a question that comes up in a non-trivial number of cases.
Right. So a colleague published a study in December that proposes that in the last 25 years plus, a significant percentage of medals at the World and Olympic Championships in the affected events, and that's something we haven't talked about, but there's a list of events that are at issue too. But in the affected events were won by women with these particular differences of sex development, which there's apparently an overrepresentation, according to the study, an overrepresentation of 1,700-fold to the population representation.
Wow. So maybe we could talk a little bit about that concept of represented events, because, it's my understanding that sort of the biologically male bodies have significant advantages in perhaps some sporting events, but not in others. And people like Nancy Leong have suggested that, well, maybe we should focus women's sports on sports where those advantages wouldn't make a difference. So I wonder maybe you can kind of identify sort of when and why it is important, and why that answer to your mind is like not adequate, or that it's still important to have differentiated sports.
The sports that we that exist today and that are represented at the at the world's level, and then the NC2A level as well, of course, tend to be sports that privilege male physical and physiological advantages. They were developed in a period where only men, or primarily men, competed, and then women's sports and events were added that were the same, or pretty much the same, right? With some adjustments, like women's gymnastics is different and women's skating is scored differently. But in the main, there was men's track, and when women's track was added to parallel men's track, and eventually we had all the same distances in event. We had all the same distances. It doesn't happen exactly that way in every sport, but in general, the point that women's sport is that women are disadvantaged in relation to men in sport is because sport privileges male advantages is an accurate statement or reflection or critique. We could, and I've heard Nancy on this, she's good. We could imagine a different world where we made up sports, or we invented sports that privileged either female characteristics, physiological and physical characteristics, or that that neutralized them, that didn't involve a handicap like in golf, it's women's tees, men's tees, or whatever, but that didn't involve either men's or women's privileges. I guess privileges is the wrong word, but advantages. But those aren't the ones that are being featured by sport and sport as a business in this period, right? And so we could imagine a different and maybe better world, but that world doesn't exist today. And so, what I'm focused on is the reality on the ground, and the reality on the ground is that if we want to see females on the podium, if we want to see females in finals, we need an eligibility rule that recognizes the very real performance gap between males and females that is physiologically and biologically based, and that is tied to sex-linked traits. And that's super controversial in this period, right? As we're sort of growing our sense of what sex is, how it's not always binary, how it's not inclusive of people whose gender identity doesn't conform to their biology. So it's controversial to make a claim about the validity of a space that is based in our sex-linked biology in this period. But the reality is that that in sport, it is inevitable that we have that conversation. And even if it ends up that we abandon sport as we know it today, or abandon the women's category, that's a policy choice that might or might not be based in the necessary understanding of the biology.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So as I understand your argument, it's kind of fundamentally based an idea of what it means for competition in sport to be fair, and the idea that for it to be fair for biologically women competing, that it's not fair to expect them to compete against people who are biologically male, because it will basically be impossible for them, or broadly speaking, impossible for them to win, basically, and that they deserve a chance.
As long as we're talking groups, right?
Right. Of course.
There are always individual female athletes who can beat individual male athletes.
Of course. But like broadly speaking, that the competition would be unfair to them. It seems to me that for a lot of people, they seem to care more about the questions of sort of people being able to have, or maybe care more about people being able to express the gender and sex identity, the gender identity, and to claim the sex identity that they experience, and that maybe they prioritize that over the fairness question. And I wonder how you would respond to people with sort of like a different normative perspective as to what we should care more about. Like, they might recognize the value of what you're saying, but say that this other concern is more salient, more important to me, and I think we should focus on that instead.
I would never tell someone what is more salient to them. Well, let me think about how to say this. That is an entirely legitimate policy position. And so that's why I ended my last comment with, that's a policy discussion that is a legitimate policy discussion, right? We could decide, and lots of people think this way, we could decide that for lots of reasons that the carve out for women's sport doesn't make sense. A lot of people still think that way. They thought that way in 1960 and 1970, and they still feel that way today. A lot of people don't think we should be spending any time and money on sport at all. Then lots of people, reducing it, the pool, right? Then there are a lot of people who don't think we should spend money and time on women's sport. And especially as if spending time and money on women's sport means excluding people whose biology doesn't conform with their identity, all I can say is that's an entirely legitimate policy perspective to have. as we have the discussion about that and whether to amend the eligibility standard for girls and women's sport to include those whose gender identity is different from their biology, I only encourage people, and this is all I do. I encourage people to understand why we have the carve out in the first place, the good that girls and women's sport does, right? And I'm talking about elite sport now. The good that girls and women's elite sport does now, the power it holds, the empowerment power it holds in societies around the world, and to make an intelligent assessment. Not just an emotional one, but an emotional one too, because there are inevitably emotions involved, especially on the side of gender identity, right? But to make an intelligent assessment of the costs and benefits of a rule change. Because the benefits of women's sport are pretty outstanding, and it's and they go well beyond any individual benefit to the single woman who might be the champion on any given day. I think there's a general understanding. For example, Title IX is one of the most popular pieces of federal legislation ever enacted in the United States. I think there's a generally held, not necessarily by everyone, of course, but there's a generally held view that girls and women's sport has been an incredibly powerful, empowering, positive institution in American society and in societies worldwide. And so my goal, or one of my goals, is simply to get people to include an understanding of those benefits as they engage in the larger policy discussion about the existence of women's sport, and then any changes to the eligibility standard for women's sport, because the result would look very different if the eligibility standard were changed to gender identity without any requirement for hormone changes.
Right.
Because the requirements for hormone changes are at a minimum.
So we've been talking about elite sport, I think pretty much exclusively. Does that suggest that you think maybe we should think about the question differently when it comes to kind of less elite? I don't know, I kind of put like more amateur sport, or like, children's sporting leagues and so on, or do we still need to be cognizant of this issue? Should we think about it differently in different contexts, I guess is what I'm asking.
Both. I think we absolutely should think about it differently in different contexts, but we should always be cognizant of the biology. And so, for example, as I explain it, as I describe in my article, I think that we should always look at what the institutional mission is of any organization or company or government or policy. We should look at what the goal is, the mission is of that. I'll call it an institution for now, like the institution that is elite sport. We should look at the goals of that institution, decide whether they're legitimate or not. And if they're legitimate, let's talk about like how to develop a rule that gets us to those goals without being over or under inclusive. That's sort of standard anti-discrimination analysis, right? And so the goals of the Olympic Games, or the goals of the IAAF when it's running its Diamond League series or its World Championships, are very different from the goals of education-based sport in the United States, for example, right? Or at least they're very different from the goals of elementary and junior high and high school education-based sport. In the main, the goals of education-based sport, and I'll say in the United States because we're pretty different in terms of how we run sports development in this country, but the goals of sports programs in public elementary schools and public junior high schools and public high schools are largely derived from the educational goals of those institutions, right? They're about, teaching, the educational lessons would include health lessons, but they're also about teamwork. They're also about, sort of positive self-image development. They're about resilience. There are lots of educational goals associated with gym class and with after-school sports, with, intramural sports, co-ed sport, all kinds of sports, right? At the educational level, that are just like not even in the same pot as the goals. It's like almost like a different thing that you're doing in the education-based setting, and so having different rules in those contexts makes perfect sense because the goals of the institution are different. The hard space and the space that where there is likely to be the most contention, but also, even though the Semenya case is obviously very contentious, but I think long term, the hardest space is really the point in high school sport where there's an overlap and an intersection between the educational and participation goals of that institutional mission and the competitive elite goals of the mission. And so, the teams that go to the state meet or that win the state meet, or the individual who wins the state meet and goes on to regionals or nationals, where the regular season ends and the postseason begins. Those are still programs that are funded by the state for educational purposes, but they start to take on that kind of NC2A D1 big time sports. They might even be showcases for college teams, right? And so that's the space that's hard because it's both a collision between the sort of participation and educational goals and this is not about participation anymore. This is about who wins, right? Who's the best, and that's not necessarily what we're looking for in education-based sport for the most part. And so that is the really difficult place for law and policy, or for policy in this period, and then law development, because in the United States, of course, a lot of elite sport takes place in the education-based setting, and so figuring out how to articulate the goals of the institution as to that transition space. And then how we might develop eligibility standards that include everybody, including the trans kids and the intersex kids and the cis kids, include everybody, but still make the competition piece fair, is really difficult work. Great. I'm excited to talk about that. My next piece is called Sex in Law. And the idea was to do a series, and I don't know if it's 2 or 3 pieces, but to do a series of pieces that focuses on whether and to what extent sex, and by that I mean biological sex, continues to be salient in society. And the general consensus seems to be, and I say general consensus, that's not entirely fair because lots of people think it's still really salient and even primary, but the direction we're going seems to be, and I think properly so, seems to be toward a future where sex is of diminished significance, is of diminished relevance. And other things are more relevant, or neither sex nor gender identity, for example, if you want to just take those 2 characteristics for a moment, are particularly relevant. Other merits that are not about how we identify in terms of our sex or gender should be important or are important. And so I find that to be a provocative question, again, whether and where and in what circumstances sex is still relevant. And I started with sport because obviously it's an institution I know particularly well from my own personal life. But I think it's also the one that where it's easiest to make the case that sex is still relevant. Again, that's assuming that we continue to have a women's category based in sex-linked traits. And so the question moving forward is, are there any other institutions in which it should it is still relevant and should remain relevant. And so the next piece I'm working on is sex in law, and taking law as an institution as opposed to sport as an institution, and looking at the history of the law's treatment of sex, and not just the last 40 years, but over a longer historical, taking a longer historical lens. And looking at and then focusing on this period, and looking at the moves that are being made in this period to deconstruct sex to the point where it no longer exists, so that we're only talking about stereotypes, and what we should be really looking at is gender identity, and examining that move in the historical context, and making some observations about that, and again with the overarching theme being law as an institution, like sport as an institution. What is law's role in society, and how does its treatment of sex, how should its treatment of sex be developed going forward?
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show, Doriane. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
You're so welcome, Brian. It was my pleasure.
Miss Katharine Hepburn.
We know the music, we sing the words. Sometimes I wonder, though, do we really listen? Do we feel the sense of the words? My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty. Of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. You know the other verses. Their meaning is precious to all of us. The Armed Forces Bicentennial Caravan tells of America's stirring national music and the history of our nation's fight for freedom. I suggest that you pay it a visit